Hey y'all, it's Mary Betsy of marybetsy.com, and in this video we're talking about frame rates and shutter speed, which is a topic that can confuse a lot of people, so I'm gonna try to break it down and make it easy for y'all. And of course, I'm gonna hook you up with a cheat sheet that you can download for absolutely free in the link in the description below. So before we get into it, first we need to have a little chat about how the camera works. Inside your camera, there's this thing called a sensor, and every time this sensor is exposed to the light of the world, it records information about what it's seeing and it takes a picture. How does it do that? I don't know. That's some physics mess that I don't understand and you don't need to either. But just trust me, every time your sensor is exposed to the light, it takes a picture. Now the gatekeeper of your camera's sensor is something called the shutter. And it's like a giant eyelid that opens and closes over the sensor. Every time the shutter's closed, your sensor sees nothing. And every time the shutter's open, your sensor gets to see the world and take a picture of it. And speaking of pictures, that is all video is. So when your camera is recording video, it's really just taking a whole bunch of pictures and lining them up really fast so that you get a video. And every one of those pictures is called a frame. So a frame is just a picture. And if you zoom all the way in on a timeline in your editor, you can actually navigate through your video frame by frame and see all of these images lined up. Now, the more pictures that your camera's sensor gets to record at a time, the smoother your video will look. So think about a flip book. The more drawings that an artist makes, the smoother the animation will look. But the fewer the number of images, the choppier the motion will look. And the same is true for video. The more frames that are recorded per second, or the higher the frame rate, the smoother the motion will look, like the video on the left. But if there are not enough frames per second, or the frame rate is too low, then the motion is going to look jittery and choppy like the video on the right. Alright, so now let's talk about the difference between frame rate and shutter speed, and this is something that trips up a lot of people. So frame rate is the number of frames that are recorded in a second, and shutter speed is how long each frame is exposed for. So frame rate is determined by how many times the shutter opens in a second to let your sensor see the light and take a picture. So if you wanted to record at a frame rate of 30 frames per second, that means your camera's sensor will record 30 frames onto your video a second. Or if you set your camera to 60 frames per second, you get twice as many frames recorded every second. So frame rate is the number of frames, and shutter speed is how long each frame is recorded for. So the slower the shutter speed, the longer the shutter stays open every time, and the more time the sensor has to record every frame. But the faster the shutter speed, the less time the shutter stays open every time, and the less time the sensor has to record each frame. And how long the shutter stays open ultimately affects how each frame looks. Let me explain. So let's say it takes Miles 1 second to move his hand from side to side. If I'm filming him and I set my shutter speed to be really slow, like 1/5 of a second, then the shutter is going to stay open for 1/5 of a second every time the sensor records a frame. And 1/5 of a second is like an eternity when it comes to shutter speeds. Because in 1/5 of a second, Miles' hand would have already moved from here to here. And the camera is recording a frame the entire time. And that means that the final frame is going to look really blurry. But let's say I set the shutter speed to be something really fast, like only 1/2000th of a second. In that amount of time, Miles' hand would have barely moved. So the image would look like this, like the motion is frozen. So the faster the shutter speed, the more you'll freeze motion, and the slower the shutter speed, the more you'll blur motion. Now let's talk about something really important when it comes to shutter speed, which is your shutter speed cannot be lower than your frames per second. And let's look at an example to see why. So let's say we set our frame rate to 30 frames per second, and we set our shutter speed to 1/15th of a second. If you think about that, then mathematically this doesn't work. Because if your shutter has to stay open for 1/15th of a second every time, then it can only open and close 15 times in a second. But then you're not going to get 30 frames because the shutter has to open to create a frame. So what happens is your footage ends up looking like this choppy, jittery mess. So it's super, super important that you never use a shutter speed that's lower than your frame rate or your footage is going to be choppy. So if your frame rate is 30 frames per second, then your shutter speed can never be lower than 1/30th of a second. Or if your frame rate is 60 frames per second, don't use a shutter speed lower than 1/60th of a second, and so on. So what frame rate and shutter speed should you use? Well, we've talked about how a higher frame rate means that you're going to have smoother looking motion. So you don't want a frame rate that's too low. And generally, anything lower than 24 frames per second is going to compromise this. And this is why Hollywood has used 24 frames per second as their golden frame rate for decades. Hollywood wanted a frame rate that was as low as possible because they wanted cheap film, but they didn't want it so low that the movies were going to look like a flip book. And because movies have been shot in 24 frames per second for so long, many filmmakers think that this is the frame rate that looks the most cinematic. Now, you can look at footage shot in different frame rates and make up your own mind, but in general, 24 frames per second is an excellent frame rate to use. So if you're filming at 24 frames per second, then what shutter speed should you use? Well, we know it's important not to use a shutter speed that's lower than our frame rate. So we know our shutter speed needs to be at least 1/24th of a second, but that's actually kind of a slow shutter speed, so our motion could look a little blurry. Remember how blurry Miles' hand looked when we used a slow shutter speed. So why don't we just jack the shutter speed up really high then? Well, hold up, because that would get rid of all the blur in our motion. And we don't want to do that because when we see the world, we actually see motion with blur. Like if you take your hand and wave it in front of your face, you're going to see some motion blur. So you can see the blur at a slower shutter speed of 1/60th of a second, but not at a faster one at 1/2000th of a second. So I would say that most filmmakers want to use a shutter speed that's not too high because they don't want to get rid of all the motion blur. So then if we're shooting at 24 frames per second, then what is that perfect shutter speed so that we get the most natural looking motion blur? Well, the general rule of thumb is that you should take whatever your frame rate is and double it, and that is the best shutter speed you can use. So if your frame rate is 24 frames per second, then the best shutter speed is 1/48th of a second. Now, if we go to the shutter speed setting on our camera though, there's no 1/48th. So we'll just round up to 1/50th and that'll work just fine. Now, there are times when you might want to break this rule, and I talk about those more in the exposure lesson that's in my filmmaking course at marybetsy.com. But if you do break this rule and you use a shutter speed that's too high, like probably nobody is going to know unless there's some filmmaking snob. But in general, it's a good rule to follow to use a shutter speed that is twice of your frame rate, and then you're going to get natural looking motion blur. Now let's talk about how do you use frame rates to create slow motion in your videos. But first, you should understand that you can set your frame rate in two places. So you can tell your camera how many frames to record in a second onto your footage, and then you can tell your sequence how many frames to play in your final video in a second. And you'll see that 24 frames per second is the lowest recommended frame rate for a sequence in your editor, because remember, you need at least 24 frames per second or your footage is going to look choppy. Now, when you create slow motion, that just means that you're stretching out the frames in your footage in a sequence on your timeline so that they play over a longer time. And you do that by selecting a clip in your timeline, right-clicking it, going to speed, and then let's say you set the speed to 50%. That means the clip will play at half speed, and it's going to take twice as long to play in your timeline. So let's say we have footage recorded at 24 frames per second, and we stretch out the frames so that they play slowly over 2 seconds instead of 1. Well, that creates an issue because now we only have 12 frames per second, and that's not enough. So that means our video is going to be choppy. Now let's look at this in real life. So here we've got our sequence and our footage both set to 24 frames per second. So if I drop that footage onto my timeline, and then I right-click it, go to speed, and then I slow the footage down to 50%, then you'll see that the clip is now twice as long. But when I play that back, the footage looks stuttery and choppy and not so cute. And so that means that for slow motion, you want the frame rate of your footage to be higher than 24 frames per second. And in most cameras, that means you should set your frame rate to 60 or 120 frames per second. Because if you have 60 frames per second in your footage and you stretch that out to play in slow motion over 2 seconds instead of just 1, then you'll have 30 frames per second. And that's fine because it's more than the minimum of 24. Now let's look at that in real life. So here I've got footage recorded at 60 frames per second, and my sequence is again set to 24 frames per second. So if I take that footage and I move it to my timeline, and then I set the speed to be only 50%, and then I play back that footage, it's going to look nice and smooth. And you can see how much smoother that slow motion footage looks on the left at a high frame rate of 60 frames per second then on the right at a low frame rate of 24 frames per second. And the higher the frame rate, the slower you can make your footage. So if our footage was shot at 120 frames per second and we stretch 1 second of that footage out over 5 seconds, then that would make our footage play at only 20% speed, but it's still going to look good because we have our minimum of 24 frames per second. But if your brain is hurting from all that math and you're like, Mary, I am an artist, I don't deal with numbers, then don't worry, I got you. It's all in the cheat sheet. I've done the math for you, and I've shown you how slow you can make footage shot at common frame rates. And again, you can download that for absolutely free in the link in the description. So you might be asking, if a high frame rate gives me the flexibility to put any footage that I shoot in slow motion, then why wouldn't I just always shoot at a high frame rate? Well, because even though high frame rates record more images per second, the quality of those images can sometimes be less depending on your camera. Because when the camera's recording at a high frame rate, it's more stressful for the camera, so it has to compromise somewhere else. So the camera might record at a lower resolution, like 720p, or maybe it'll force your camera into crop mode instead of full frame mode, and that could let less light onto your image. And speaking of light, higher frame rates also mean that you have to use a higher shutter speed, because remember, your shutter speed can never be lower than your frame rate. And when you use a high shutter speed, that lets less light in. And that could be a problem if you're shooting in a low light environment. So what this means is that ultimately it's best to decide what frame rate you want to use based on how you want your final video to look. So if I'm recording scenes that I want to play back at normal speed in my final video, like somebody talking, I'll record that at 24 frames per second or possibly at 30 frames per second, because that'll give me a little flexibility to slow a clip down to 80% speed if I want. But if I'm filming something like a first dance that I know I'm going to want to slow down in my edit to give it that dreamy feeling that time has stopped, then I'll film it at 60 or 120 frames per second. And when it comes to slow motion, it's really important to use it intentionally. So if you film everything at 120 frames per second and then slow all of your clips down to just 20% speed, it's going to take forever for any action to take place in a scene, and it's just going to make your video look boring. Another thing to keep in mind about slow motion is that it can help camera movements look less shaky. So if I'm hand holding this shot of Miles and I play it back at 100% speed, it looks a little bumpy. But if I slow that footage down, all of a sudden it looks smooth and steady. Now let's talk about where to set the frame rate on your camera. If you use a Canon camera, then your frame rate menu might look something like this. The frame rate is followed by a P, so 59.94p would be 59.94 frames per second. And you're going to see that the frame rates here are not even numbers. They've got these decimals, but don't worry about that. Just round up to the nearest frame rate you want to use. To the left of the frame rate, you'll see some resolution options like Full HD for 1080, and to the right, you'll see some letters that have to do with compression. And I would pick the ALLI option because MJPEG files are tremendous and IPP files are lower quality. If you're using a Sony camera, then your frame rate menu might look something like this. And with the frame rate, you're also going to see another number followed by an M, which stands for megabytes per second, or how many megabytes per second is the camera recording onto your footage, which is also known as bitrate. So choose the highest bitrate if you want the highest quality video and also the highest file size. But remember to use a memory card that has a bitrate that is at least as high as the one you're recording in. Okay, let's recap. Frame rate is the number of frames recorded per second, and shutter speed is how long each frame is exposed. You should never use a shutter speed that's lower than your frame rate, or your footage will look choppy. Use slower shutter speeds to blur motion, and higher shutter speeds to freeze it. And if you want natural looking motion blur, then use a shutter speed that's double your frame rate. For scenes that you want to play at normal speed in your final video, like scenes of people talking, try to record at 24 frames per second with a shutter speed of 1/50th of a second for natural motion blur. For scenes you want to play in slow motion, record at 60 frames per second and a shutter speed of 1/125th. And for scenes that you want to play in super slow motion, record at 120 frames per second and a shutter speed of 1/250th. But remember that higher frame rates can reduce the quality of your video, so try to only use them when you need them. And don't forget that you can find all these rules, all these number combinations summed up on a free cheat sheet, which you can download and use on your phone when you're in the field, and you can get that for free in the link in the description. And if you're interested in more lessons like this where I break down camera settings, then check out my online course on filmmaking at marybetsy.com. All right, that's it. Thanks for watching. Bye, y'all. Peace.